Hi, this is Professor McGuire, and welcome to our last video lecture discussing our generalized topic of environmental law and looking specifically at global environmental law. As a reminder, all of these video lectures are available on the YouTube website under my web name, and specifically the environmental law lectures are all available in the environmental law playlist at that website. You can also find other materials from other courses and interrelated videos that I've identified here, like the hierarchy of laws in previous videos, but all of these materials are freely available. And if you're taking the environmental law course, this is the final topic in our overview and discussion of environmental law from the policy perspective. By way of introduction, global environmental law is really an attempt to find some common ground on environmental issues among two or more nations. So it's important that when we talk about global environmental law, we sort of define what are we talking about here, practically speaking. And what we're really talking about is where you have nation states. So you have the United States as a nation, and you have, Canada, I'm just thinking here in North America, for example, that, close by, but Canada as a sovereign nation state, and you have Mexico as a sovereign nation state. And these countries, because of their proximity to one another and because of other sort of interrelated, you might have, we've had a lot of commonalities. You have a lot of people migration between the countries. So you have people from ancestry that come from, areas where they're ancestors have come from places in the United States, places in Canada, and certainly places in Mexico where we've moved back and forth between and established ourselves. And so we have a lot of common sort of interrelationships, and that can extend from sort of the social context to political concerns, political connections, and deep economic connections as well, where we have economic interdependencies. And you can see where that can then generate the impetus for the countries working together in common interest, where you find common ground on issues and a variety of issues. And of course, we're talking about environmental issues. So in our context, we can think about where you have environmental issues in common. I think I mentioned earlier under our examination of pollution, for example, that areas of Southern California and elsewhere, but when under the Clean Air Act, we have that federal US law has these sort of air sheds. It identifies these areas where air moves, and generally where you can see where there's these sort of areas where you can then identify air quality standards and try to create rules and regulations to ensure that the air quality within these regions is maintained to the identified, sufficient air quality for human health and well-being, et cetera. And I think I mentioned in Southern California, for example, there's a lot of interrelationship because the border that's shared between Southern California and Mexico, there's a lot of shared interest between northern Mexico, parts of northern Mexico and that particular area of Southern California to work collaboratively to ensure that air quality is met for both nations. But certainly it's very hard for Southern California to maintain its air quality standards if it's not working cooperatively with Mexico in that case, because the air does not, there's no hard border for the air. So what Southern California does that can affect air quality can have an influence on that the near area of Mexico, and certainly what Mexico does can have an influence depending on prevailing winds at any given time on the air quality in Southern California. So it makes sense that that these two nations, these two sovereign nations work together, much like what we've discussed in terms of states within the United States, sovereign states, whether it's California working with Arizona, for example, a neighboring sovereign state, or Utah, or any of the Nevada, or any of the other states that might be in close proximity to California, if you go north, Oregon, et cetera. And certainly that occurs throughout the nation, that they have to work cooperatively in many ways in order to find common ground. These are states within the federal and under our federalism. And you can see the same thing, for example, in the European Union, which might act as a quasi equivalent to a federalism sort of system, where you have the the countries that make up the European Union, each being individual nation sovereigns. And then each of those countries also must have working relationships with other countries, whether they're also members of the European Union or outside of the European Union, in order to find common ground on issues that are of common interest. And so when we talk about global environmental law, we're really talking about these nations and how these nations interact with one another on issues that are of common interest. In my example of the Clean Air Act, that is a federal law in the United States. It's not a law of Mexico. So the United States, in order to meet its internal objectives of clean air in certain areas, might work or try to find opportunities to work with Mexico. And that can be informal. That can be just, working in sort of like memorandums of agreement that aren't sort of formalized and given any sort of major enforcement capacity. It's just sort of like best efforts. And if you can, this would be good, but there's no sort of like you think a formalized law, a formalized policy would have all of these sort of like both carrots, as we call them, right? Both incentives and sticks, sort of penalties to help to positive and negative reinforcement mechanisms effectively. In informal agreements, there's really no, there's no penalty, no mandatory penalty, and that's one of the ideas behind sovereignty, of course, is that I choose what I want to do as a nation. I don't have to do something just because you think I should do it, you being another nation. And so there's all kinds of ways in which you can try to, work together. So if there's a law like the Clean Air Act in the United States and California, Southern California is having a hard time in its particular airshed obtaining certain identified air quality standards, and it needs to work with Mexico, it can do a number of things informally to try to, get Mexico to work with it to achieve certain goals. And in other cases, it may be that if the interest is shared between the countries to such a degree that they're willing to both bind themselves, then you can get into a situation where maybe Mexico enters into a formal agreement with the United States because its interests are also served equally, as well as the United States. And both countries see that the benefits of formalizing this arrangement, creating effectively penalties for each other for not complying, and also enshrining, think of like a contract, a formalized contract between nations, enshrining the requirements and duties in order to do these things, to achieve these goals. It gives a level of assurance that each country will do what they intend, what they say they will do, and it provides a mechanism for redressing the instance where one country feels that the other country isn't meeting its obligations or requirements. And in those cases, you can see where that formalization can be helpful. And in this case, if in our example here, we might have a situation where we might have a bilateral agreement between these two nations, and that's another example, a more formalized version. So if rather than informal, we have a formalized version of a bilateral agreement. And we might also have cases, what used to be NAFTA under a new acronym today, where we might have for economic interest, shared economic interest, we might have a multilateral, not a bilateral between two nations, but a multilateral agreement between more than two nations. In this case, between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, about shared agreements about trade, about how goods and services are provided and moved between the countries. The European Union, one of the greatest strengths, there are many to speak of, but one of the greatest strengths between the European Union is that it's effectively the free movement of people and goods for the most part between the member states, which provides really an important way for for trade, for specialization, all kinds of, we don't want to get into the economic underlying theories that underpin this, but nations that are really good at doing certain things figure out what that is, where they can do it for the for the best amount and the highest quality, and they can then provide those things to the without any sort of barriers, which would be like tariffs, et cetera, any barriers to that trade to other member states of the European Union, and the others can figure out what they do. Comparative advantage would be one term that's used to identify this, but the idea is that effectively what happens is that when everybody works without any barriers, they can figure out what they do best relative to everyone else. And that provides an opportunity for everyone getting the best products at effectively the lowest prices, and it increases overall wealth. We call it the pie. They grow the pie, and everybody benefits within that group. And that's some of the reasons. It's an economic argument for why you would want to have free trade amongst countries, between countries, that sort of thing. And it doesn't always work perfectly. Sometimes there's a lot of displacement that happens with free trade between countries. It can have an effect on domestic markets in terms of the relative comparative advantage. If you find another country that can generate for essentially the same quality because of, let's say, labor costs, because of what they might have a comparative advantage in terms of their financial situation. They might have a currency that is devalued just as a matter of fact relative to the currency, say the United States, the US dollar, and therefore their labor costs are much lower on a sort of apples to apples comparison, dollar to dollar comparison basis. And so for them, it's easier, it's cheaper to produce products of similar quality. So you might have manufacturing displacement and that sort of thing when you open up trade. But then generally speaking, evidence shows that overall there's great benefits. And we can, for those that study that area and understand it to some degree, you can sort of have a corollary when you think about environmental conditions. There are a lot of environmental issues. I mentioned air, certainly climate change, carbon is a global issue, but we can think of large scale environmental issues that have global implications. And they're really hard to manage on a domestic level, meaning that, just doing something in one nation doesn't necessarily mean that it solves the problem for either that nation or the larger global actors if it is a global environmental issue. So when we talk about global environmental law, many times we're talking about, at least today, with global issues. There are other issues that are national issues that are just priorities, and we'll talk a little bit about how those play out. But most importantly, we're talking about these larger global issues. National sovereignty is always an important issue of consideration when we talk about global environmental law. And that's for the very simple reason, as I mentioned already, that when you are a sovereign, you are not required to do something that another country wants you to do. There is no requirement. You can, like I said, you can move from no arrangement, no agreement, to informal agreements, which I can do it if I want to more formalized agreements. But even in those formalized agreements, depending on the language, right? If we think of it as a contract, the language that's stated within those formalized agreements, the language might be something like best efforts, we'll try as hard as we can. And that's effectively, almost an informal agreement. Formalized, right? There's a formalized document, you signed onto it, you ratified it, you have an international accord, an international agreement, you're a signatory to this international treaty. Sometimes that's what they're called, but this basically multilateral agreement between nations about doing something. But the language itself effectively makes it informal. It doesn't require you to do anything other than your self-defined best efforts, for example. So we can have examples where we have formalized agreements that in practice are relatively informal at best in terms of what they require. And all of this comes back to the notion that I don't have to do anything. I don't have to sign on to this. I don't have to agree to this if I don't want to. You cannot force me to do something that I don't want to do. And that's sovereignty. And that's something that we always have to consider in global issues, whether it's environmental issues or any other issue. So one of the things that we can think about then is when we think about national sovereignty, we really want to have interests. We want to identify issues that are shared interests. So we can say what environmental issues are common to different nations and are all nations, the global community, because those are the types of issues where it's more likely that you're going to get buy-in. You're going to get other countries interested in doing something because of self-interest. And, climate change has to be a good example. As the effects of climate change become more apparent, as they become more entrenched, then countries are going to, out of self-interest, because of the effects it's having in their own countries, are going to have to start, thinking about, well, it's important because no matter what we do domestically, it really matters what others do as well. Because even if we cut our carbon emissions, for example, it doesn't mean that will solve the problem, because other countries are still collectively emitting significant amounts of carbon if they don't also do something domestically. And so that's one example. There are many other economics. Again, we talk about many of these global accords that we have economic consideration. We have the World Trade Organization, for example. That's for, agreements, sort of generalized agreements. Think about it as a big treaty, effectively a big sort of agreement on trade. And if you meet the requirements and you are a member and you agree to be a member and you get certified, then you have all of these sort of benefits regarding trade relative to other countries, and you're also protected from unfair practices of other countries against you, so on and so forth. So there are many examples of these types of things from other perspectives, but we're looking at it from the environmental perspective. So the first thing we have to do is we have to say what kind of issues are really important. We've also had global environmental issues like endangered species, for example. We've had global CITES as one example. It's a convention on the international trade of endangered species, CITES. That's another one sort of where the United States has a national law called the Endangered Species Act. This would be sort of it's not a complete analog, but at a global level, something similar where other countries have understood that, if a species becomes endangered, that's not something that's just unique to a particular nation, although that species might exist solely in that nation or other nations. That generally speaking, it's of all nations' concern when we start depleting the globe of its diversity of species. That's one example. So we can think about those environmental issues that are in common. And then even if the issues are in common, even we have common issues, we can look at the legal and historical perspectives and identify that they may be different. What I mean by that is, even if you identify an issue between nations that are consistent, the issue that is consistent between those nations. So it's like, oh, we all worry about this, climate change, carbon emissions. That's something we all have a general concern about because it has effects to all of us. The effects don't have to be equal. They can actually be disproportionate. Like it affects me more than it affects you, but it affects everyone. And it continues to affect, and the effects are increasing over time. So we all are interested in this. But then, even though you might have shared interest, you have different historical and legal perspectives to apply. And that affects how you look at the problem and how you can deal with the problem. And one simple example that we've identified in the past is, what is your status? And we say, these are incomplete terms, but developing versus developed nation, right? Have you spent a lot of time since industrialization, since about the main 1850s? Have you been one of the sort of forerunner nations in industrializing your economies? And if you have, there are these other nations that really haven't. They've been doing it much later, much more recent. So there's a simple question of generalized fairness. It's like, well, sure, cut your carbon emissions. However, that's still an important mechanism. We don't have all of the technological replacements to just, subvert, just not use carbon intensive activities in our sort of manufacturing process or industrialization process. As a result of that, we really should still be able to be free to generate, electricity using carbon and, use carbon as an input into a number of things we do, transportation, et cetera. And that shouldn't be an issue because we haven't historically been able to develop. So, we don't have the wealth that you've generated from carbon intensive activities to move to new technologies as fast as you. So that's one thing. And then there's what are your legal traditions? And then do they comport to other traditions? You might have a very different legal history and set of legal traditions that you apply to issues that are just different in kind as to how other nations might apply those very same legal traditions. And so that's something that's difficult, and that creates another level nuance of difficulty. So the goal here is to understand these issues generally, as far as what we're trying to do in terms of introducing global environmental law as a subject. So we want to understand these issues generally and identify the legal mechanisms that can be used to address these global environmental issues. What, generally speaking, are the kinds of legal mechanisms that have existed, with a couple of examples. In terms of an overview, to start that process, conceptually, we can say that global environmental law has a first order problem. This is sort of the problem that you need to deal with upfront before you start getting into the meat of what's the environmental issue, et cetera, et cetera. And that's wide agreement on the relationship between environmental health and human well-being. So the first order problem is kind of like what we've talked about throughout this course and throughout the other lectures regarding how we consider the environment and when we consider the environment to be at risk. You know, we put humans, and in the United States, in most of our environmental laws, human health, human well-being is the centerpiece. It's the sort of measuring stick. It's the compass by which we measure or determine or get a trajectory on environmental health. If that water is degraded to the point where humans cannot consume it, that's a problem, because human consumption is the definition. It's the measure by which we're defining the problem, if that makes sense. We've talked about this. So other nations, you know, maybe they use a similar, you know, sort of standard, but maybe they use a different standard as well, right? So that's sort of the first order problem, is coming to terms with what we mean between environmental health and human well-being, or just what is an environmental issue that is of concern globally. So that's a first order problem. So categorizing the environment or environmental issues as a constraining factor of social institutions and economic activity. That, you know, so the one way to contextualize that first order problem is to think about our way of thinking about constraining factors. And I will bring that up in a moment. But if you remember, we have the environment as our ultimate constraining factor. This is sort of like a sort of a priori or foundational sort of tenet by which we define environmental well-being and environmental health, or whether there's an environmental problem. And we understand those problems contextually by saying, look, no matter what our economy does, no matter what our society, our social institutions, right, no matter what they prioritize, no matter what they value, no matter, you know, how they interpret, you know, the effects on economic activity, all of our societal you know, institutional frameworks and all of our economic activity is constrained by environment. The environment is the constraining factor, and we've talked ad nauseum to some degree about this. I brought it up many times, both in the overview of materials and then consistently as we talk through the other video lectures about the environment being the constraining factor and where that comes from. Steady state, the Earth is a closed system, relatively speaking. And so, you know, equilibrium shifts throughout that system. Those are all of the background sort of tenets or philosophies or beliefs that are founded in scientific knowledge and understanding. There's an objective basis for these tenets and beliefs that are the foundation for identifying the environment as the constraining factor. But that is not necessarily how other nations might look at this problem. It's not necessarily how the United States looks at this problem or prioritizes environmental problems. So what we need then is that first part of that first order problem is agreeing on concepts of what is a global society and economy. So if the environment, the global environment, the Earth is the constraining factor for our actions, we can look within that and look at those social institutions and economic institutions, and we can say, well, you know, do we agree what those social institutions and social frameworks are? Do we agree on that? And do we agree on what constitutes economic activity or the economic drivers? Are we in agreement as a global society? Within a nation, we might be in agreement, but between nations, there might be higher levels of disagreement on exactly where those priorities are, how those terms are defined, how social institutions and economy, right? So there's just, it's a lot more amorphous. There's a lot less definitiveness and form given to some of this. So it makes it harder because as a first order issue, we have to agree on what does this mean? And do we have a generalized agreement on when we say this, when we say society, economy, and environment, that we have general agreement between us, that we can see what each other's saying and understanding and connect those ideas and then basically come to some agreement, right? A little bit of give and take between nations on these topics and issues. So, you know, when we talk about global society and economy, for example, that can create issues because the carbon, for example, right? Again, I said, you know, developed versus developing nations is probably a good example. It's like you've used carbon for decades and decades, and most of the carbon that's in the atmosphere now is a result of your historical activities, you nation A, B, and C, you know, developing nations. But why should we then bear the cost of now limiting ourselves through that same level of development or that same process of development? Why can't we do that same kind of development if it's the cheapest way for us to go? Why can't we use those same methods? Why do we have to limit our, you know, development? You never did, just because now there's a problem. So there's one example, right? So, you know, there's right there, that starts a process of distinguishing, and even those terms, developed versus developing, it starts making distinguishing characteristics between nations with false lines, just drawing these lines based on not necessarily arbitrary, but just factors that may or may not be, or variables that may or may not be helpful in defining ultimately what we're talking about when we talk about an environmental issue. So, what brings us together in commonality versus what sort of starts separating us. So, these concepts of society and economy are important. And if we start distinguishing between them, it makes it harder for us to come together and say, look, we all need to act equally. And there are ways, so the developed versus developing nations is a problem. But there are ways to mitigate this. And, we've talked about this. This has been talked about, not that we in the lectures, but this has been talked about for many years now, is the notion of, technology transfer is one example. So well, you're right. There's a different way to generate energy. We talked about this, right? There are renewable methods. There are some nations that are sort of ahead of others in terms of developing these technologies and advancing them in terms of research. Why isn't it that? So maybe we should be more, when it comes to these things that we might define, if we think about our categories as public goods, right? Our types of goods, characteristics, divisibility, excludability, we talked about already. So if we think more of these things like energy generation as a public good, a global public good, then maybe the mechanisms, the technologies that are advancing our understanding of doing this in different ways, maybe those are sort of like the common, to take a term from one of these global environmental agreements, conventions, the Law of the Sea Convention. Maybe we talk about this as sort of the similar way that we talk about international waters that nobody owns, is the common heritage of humankind. And so maybe, some of these technologies are like that they become, even though, of course, you have to incentivize, and we have a market system here in the United States, and R&D definitely has a lot of public money. It works through, federal government incentives in many ways in the United States through our university systems for research and development, and then that's transferred over into the private industry that then takes that and moves that into more R&D. So there's a lot of public input, but ultimately we do have at least partially a free market system that helps to develop these technologies, and there has to be incentives, financial incentives for reaping the benefits. But sometimes we have to look at these things in a deeper lens, maybe, and we have to start thinking about them. If we're thinking about this global society and economy, we have to think about some of these technologies maybe as more sort of public goods, generalized public goods, that their use and adoption is something that's important for the global society for really, really important reasons that affect our own individual nation, if you want to call it well-being. So technology transfer is one way to mitigate that. It's like, yes, you're right. If you had to figure everything out like we did, yes, this is probably cheaper for you to use carbon right now. However, we have a technology that we've developed, and we can give you that, fast forward basically through the carbon process, and now move directly into the, this other technology use. So there's that opportunity, for example, in a number of different contexts. And again, this is all geared towards a context, a policy issue identification context, where we're saying there's global environmental issues. They are important issues. They need to be dealt with. Some of them are incredibly acute, have lots of costs associated with them, and those costs are aggregating. So we want to mitigate that. So from a global perspective, what are the sort of policies we can, implement, and how do we implement them at the global level to achieve the goals as quickly as possible? Shortest distance between two dots is a straight line, right? So how do we create a policy that is as short as possible and directly addresses the issue? So that's a conceptually, we have to think about this first order problem, but then also we have to identify and implement legal mechanisms that bind nations to a common environmental goal. So beyond identifying this first order problem, we then have to consider, is it going to be informal? Well, informal is not going to be very helpful, right? We need to move towards agreements between nations, multilateral agreements between many nations that are binding, that have binding contractual language, that have carrots and sticks, that have, and use that term, and I mean to use it loosely, but the idea is to have the mechanisms that, ensure that everyone will do exactly what they say they're doing, and best efforts, no sort of, wishy-washy language or gray area language that is mandatory, language that requires certain outcomes, certain requirements. Really important if we're going to identify and implement the kind of mechanisms at the global level that force holistically, wholly, nations to move in a direction relatively quickly to deal with some of these acute environmental issues. So the question is, hey, what do these mechanisms look like, right? And how are they enforced? And we're going to talk about that. But just to go over this idea of our sort of like first order issue, just to remember, and bringing this forward from previous, our overview of environmental law, and brought it in a number of contexts. Remember, what we're talking about here is that first order issue is really about all of these terms. First of all, there's a philosophy that there's this general sort of hierarchy that the economy is constrained by our social institutions, and both our economy and our social institutions, all human activity is constrained by environmental considerations. That's what this is meant to represent. What we were talking about in our previous, in the previous, this first order problem here, the previous slide, is that the economy, that the definition of the economy, the definition of society, and even the definition of the environment can vary between nations. And it's really important that we actually come to some agreement globally, and there are multiple, many different definitions or variances of those definitions. Even if there's generalized agreement on the definition in terms of its operational, what it looks like from an operational standpoint, can definitely vary quite a bit between nations and over a variety of nations. So it's really important to understand that point, and that's why we're bringing this up here just quickly. But in terms of the different types of environmental laws that are used at the global level, there's, generally speaking, we can look at three different types. So there's international environmental law, and that is law that is applicable to more than one country. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements, actual laws. Now, those laws can have soft language, they can have hard language, but they are actual agreements, written agreements that are signed on and ratified by a number of countries. Then there's a second category of extraterritorial application of national environmental law. And that's the law of an individual country, which can have an influence on other countries, or at the very least, it certainly has influence on members of that country while they're outside of the borders and jurisdiction of that country. And we'll get into the examples of what that might mean. So, you know, if you're a United States citizen and you have a fishing license and you go out to sea in a US flagged vessel, even though it's private, you go out and you go into international waters, you're out of the US jurisdiction, you're beyond 200 nautical miles or the exclusive economic zone of the United States, and you're in international waters and you fish. And in the process of fishing, you encounter some marine mammals, and you do something to harass or harm those marine mammals. Well, even though you're out of the US jurisdiction, you are still subject to US laws, both as US citizens and as a flagged vessel of the United States that are registered in the United States. And as a result of that, you can violate the National Marine Mammal Protection Act, for example, even though you're in international water, or if you're in another country's, water's exclusive economic zone and given permission to fish in that exclusive economic zone. So you're a US fisher and you're flagged in a US vessel and you go down to Mexican waters, and you're fishing in the Pacific in Mexican waters with Mexico's permission, and you harass some marine mammals. You may be subject to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So that's what we mean by extraterritorial application of national environmental law. The third category is comparative environmental law, and that's where we compare two individual nations. And that's really about asking how each nation using its own national law deals with the same or similar legal issues. Comparative environmental law is just a way of trying to understand how do we do things based on our domestic laws, and how does another nation do the very same kinds of things based on their domestic laws that cover the same subject area. And is there something to learn? Do they do it better than us? And better is a normative term. These are all normative terms, but right? How do they do it? How is it different from how we do it? How are their outcomes? What are their costs, right? Is it more cost effective? Does it have a better, are the outcomes achieved at a higher rate, right? There's a number of ways of looking at it. So, and just even how does it generate sort of, what are the feedback mechanisms? What sort of values does it instill? Does it make people more recalcitrant? So there are examples where, we have limitations that we place historically, for example, on, like I said, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. You have seals, for example, up in coastal Maine in the United States, and lobstermen, nearshore lobstermen, right? They would lay their pots. This is historical, going back, this has been going on for 20, 30 years, but they lay their pots, and what they they were not allowed to, maybe previously before the Marine Mammal Protection Act, they were under a belief that the seals would, go down, see the lobster in the pots, and then steal. It's an easy meal, and they would just, get into the pot, and they would grab the lobster, and they would feed on the lobster. And the lobstermen believed this, and the lobstermen believed that that was, a direct result of that they would have lower yields, that their pots would be damaged, and that was all because of the seals. So the seals were, for some, I want to be clear, this is for some, this is not, universal, that all of a sudden that the seals were enemy number one relative to, the harming their economic interests, harming the equipment they use, and taking away the lobsters. And so they would shoot the seals. Marine Mammal Protection Act comes along, no longer certainly can't shoot the seals, can't harass, can't harm the seals because they're protected in the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And this creates great frustration. So it doesn't make it, the law doesn't make lobstermen more affectionate towards seals necessarily. It doesn't make them appreciate seals more. It doesn't necessarily, right? You understand it. So we can look at our application of the Marine Mammal Protection Act vis-a-vis lobstermen in Maine, for example, relative to seals, and we can say, how does the outcomes of protecting the seals, what does it do? Is it an effective way? Does it self-enforce, right? Does it create incentives to just self-enforce? Is there a sort of a information campaign? Does it make the lobstermen want to be the champions of the seals and protect the seals, that kind of thing? And we can say, maybe in many ways it doesn't or it didn't in the way that I've described that instance. It's one description, but assuming that description is somewhat accurate, we can then look at it and say, well, that creates problems maybe. Then we can look at another country that does effectively the same thing, and we can look at how they do it, and maybe they do it in a very different way, and maybe they've created all kinds of ways of having those, information campaigns and also other observational data that shows, well, really the seals aren't doing what you think they're doing, and the seals are incredibly important in these other ways, and these other ways are incredibly important in helping either protect the ecosystem that's important for lobsters, or, just in these other things that aren't related to lobsters, but are things that you really care about for your own community. You live in this area, it's really important to have these other things, and you appreciate these other things, and seals are important in supporting these other things, and sort of creating a different mechanism by which the lobstermen of another country, let's say, for example, or fishers of another country, look at that situation and say, now we're advocates, we want to protect the seals. And so you can look at that, and you can look at those two applications of similar laws for the same outcomes to protect, marine mammals, let's say, but they have very different effects, and they have different reinforcement mechanisms or feedback mechanisms. And then you can compare those feedback mechanisms and say, wow, in the one case, there are a lot of enforcement costs in the US example, because we really have to be on them, because they still shoot the seals. They just do it under cover of dark. They try to hide themselves. They try to hide the carcasses. They try to violate the law but not get caught. So you have to increase enforcement costs. You have to have more patrols out there. So it's very expensive to protect the seals under the first instance. In the second instance, it's behavior change. So the lobstermen are actually advocates, or the fishers are advocates on behalf of the marine mammal. That's the target of the legislation. It's very low enforcement costs. They self-enforce. So that's just you understand. So there's one example of how we can do a comparative environmental law. So those are the three major categories or subsets of global environmental law. As far as the first, international environmental law, that is a process. And it's really important to say that all of these things are really, I think, particularly from the policy standpoint, but also from understanding those laws, the global environmental law in particular. But from the policy standpoint, it's really important to focus on the process. So international environmental law is really about a process of agreement between two or more countries. And it's formalized in either a written document, which we talked about, right? You can have these sort of contractual agreements, right? Or through custom. And this is old. This is an older way of doing it. It's really, it sometimes happens today, and it's usually enforced today. You see freedom of navigation as an example for, navies like the US Navy, but others that say that, it's custom is the basis upon which there's no formalized agreement that they're doing this, where they're using other territorial waters or other, exclusive economic zones to move about. But it's the custom, it's the history of the freedom of navigation. And so custom is great because custom says, well, we've always done things this way, and therefore, as a matter of law, it's been implied, even though there's not a formalized written agreement between countries, it's implied that we have the capacity to continue to do this. And that works both ways. You can't enforce custom one way and then not expect it to exist for the other in the other way. But custom is a non-written way of a sort of an old sort of, think of we talked about common law traditions, right? Laws that weren't formalized, codified, written down. We talked about nuisance, negligence, right? These types of common law traditions that are inherited. Think of a global sort of common law, even though it's not specifically common law, but a global tradition of law that's not written down, and custom is that. And it's just a set of consistent actions between nations that have been generally, because they've been allowed, agreed upon as a matter of deference. That if you haven't objected to this for 200 years, 300 years, then you've effectively agreed to it. And that's what custom really means, just through a set of actions that have been reciprocal throughout time, either between nations, bilateral customs, or multilateral customs between all nations, sort of that sort of thing. The example I was giving you is in really about non-formalized versions of passage of basically how people use the seas, of how different nations are capable of using and traveling over other nations, portions of other nations, zones, like sovereign zones, to some degree. That sovereignty is incomplete. Say they're up, somewhere between 12 and 24 nautical miles, and certainly, anywhere outside of 20 to 200 nautical miles within a certain zones of a nation that has that abuts the ocean in some way. And freedom of navigation is generally one of the customs, even though it hasn't been formalized necessarily in any particular global agreement. If that nation's not a signatory to some bilateral, multilateral agreement, that the other nations have been doing this, and so on and so forth. So that's the example I was giving of custom as an international sort of custom. But anyway, so there's a process of agreement between two or more countries, and it's formalized as either a written document or through this process of custom. And there are two main types of agreements in terms of the written agreement. We've talked about this: bilateral, between two nations. I've already introduced these concepts, right? And multilateral, where there's more than two nations. And the issue of sovereignty complicates international agreements. I mentioned that already, and I've sort of discussed that. But as far as formalized international environmental law, the sovereignty issue is really one of the most important complications. And that, like I said, it exists everywhere. It exists in terms of how I feel about what you're off, in terms of my willingness to agree to whatever terms you're trying to lay out, my desire to not be bound by very strict terms, therefore diluting. If you want me to be a signatory to this agreement, then I'd want the language to be diluted. I don't want it to be mandatory language. I want it to be voluntary, that sort of thing. We've seen this, and if you look at all of the history of most of international agreements on climate change, for example, you'll see that most of the time, in order to get more countries involved and signatories, the language has to be diluted, aka the language has to move from mandatory language, mandatory targets, mandatory requirements of carbon reductions, to more voluntary targets, best efforts, we'll try, that kind of thing, soft language, as opposed to harder mandatory language. So the issue of sovereignty complicates these international agreements all the time. The voluntary nature of becoming a party to the agreement is one reason why, and it's hard to get too specific in requirements and obligations. Otherwise, you do not get the signatories. The countries simply won't become signatories. And the reason they don't have to is because they don't have to sign. And the reason they don't have to sign is because they're sovereign nations. And there are many examples to show the difficulty for certain issues. Climate change has been really difficult, as I said, whereas you can look at the history of the development, ultimately the development of the Montreal Protocol. The protocol is just another version of an international agreement. And that was officially signed between parties back in the 1980s, I believe, the late 1980s. And ultimately it was easy. You can sort of look at the entire history of the development of, this is a CFC regulation, chlorofluorocarbon CFCs, the regulation of them on a global scale. And at the end of the day, this was a refrigerant. This was an industrialized product, a chemical. It also causes climate change, but CFCs, they wreak havoc on the ozone layer. Holes in the ozone layer means that we get a lot more of the negative externalities of sunlight. We get parts of the of the spectrum of ultraviolet rays. Ultraviolet rays are really problematic because they cause, I mean, for humans at least, skin cancer and many other problems and mutations. So, the ozone layer is an incredibly important protector of a lot of biological organisms that live on the Earth from those harmful rays. They are harmful to us as a result of, not being filtered out. CFCs degraded the ozone layer. How is it that we got all kinds of countries, capable of agreeing to, almost a complete phase out of CFCs? There's a whole history as to, defectors, that people that have signed on then have cheated. Think of the fishers that are, still killing the seals in secret at night. There's a whole history of that. But most importantly is that there was a ready-made alternative, hydrofluorocarbons. And those HFCs were cheap, they were readily available, and equally distributable as a replacement to CFC. So you could still have refrigerant in your refrigerators as you built them, in your air conditioning unit, so on and so forth, and other processes and products. And they were really readily available and easily implementable. I would then link that to the notion of it's not exactly the same, it's not an analog, but I would link it to the idea of technology transfer, the idea that, look, if you can provide global nations with a readily made alternative that is as good or better than what you're trying to reduce, then you're going to make it much easier for them to sign on to mandatory language. And in the case of the Montreal Protocol and CFCs, and in terms of their effects on the ozone layer, countries were so willing to sign on because it was very cheap for them to do so. And they were also willing to sign on to mandatory language, actually cutting out CFCs, because you made it as a global society. Those nations that had developed HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, as an alternative, they have their own problems, but in terms of CFCs, they were much better, particularly for the ozone layer. When you had that readily made alternative and you were willing to just make it equally distributable and, certainly hyper cost effective relative to the cost of CFC, so on and so forth, when you were willing to do that, then you made it easy for countries to say yes, and to say yes to mandatory language. And so we just should consider that when we think about ways in which we can develop more buy-in to carbon reductions from other countries, for example, if we want to develop more buy-in, and the importance of providing a readily made alternative at equal or lesser cost. And that's, we're working on that right now as a global society as we really ramp up the technological effectiveness, the cost of developing, solar and, photovoltaics and wind and so on and others, their efficiencies, and relatively speaking, their availability. And they're certainly, as we talked about earlier, when we talked about energy, they are incredibly cost effective in relationship to current carbon like coal and natural gas. So that's our first category. As far as the second category of global environmental law, there's the extraterritorial application of national environmental law. That's when we apply the laws of one nation outside the borders of that nation. I've already given you an example, right? You're a fisher, US flag vessel, you're either in Mexico waters or you're in international waters, you're still subject to those laws of the United States. And it generally applies to the actors, the citizen, corporation, right? And that's important because although that fisher could have been incorporated as a part of a company and in the United States, but other corporations, because you think about corporations doing activities in other countries, and engaging in actions that may violate national laws of the United States in some other country, which is interesting. Most people, the first time they hear that, they're like, "Wow, that's interesting to me." Or I'm in the United States, citizen, and I travel to another country and I commit an act that might violate U.S. law but doesn't violate that country's law. It's possible that I could be held responsible, right, for the violation of U.S. law while I'm in some other country when it doesn't necessarily violate any law in that country. So that's people are interested in that notion of extraterritorial application, but it generally applies to the actors, citizen, corporation, flag vessels of the nation engaging in activities outside that nation, but being held to the laws of that nation. The example, application of Nepa to U.S. citizens and corporations engaging in activities in other nations. I used the Marine Mammal Protection Act in my earlier example because we had a fisher out there doing something where dolphins, harassing or harming dolphins. Here we have the National Environmental Policy Act. We remember Nepa was our first major environmental law, domestic U.S. environmental law explored in the course after our introductory materials. When we apply Nepa, NEPA not only applies to, necessarily actions you take in the United States, but if I'm a corporation and I want to do something in another country, I might still, as a matter of permitting, getting permits within the United States, if there is remember, major federal action. So if there's some federal action involved in what I'm doing in that other country, then I still have to apply NEPA requirements. I still have to engage in that sort of, is there an environmental impact? Is it, a significant impact, right? Potentially EA, right? Environmental assessment versus EIS, environmental impact statement, the whole sort of process, and then the drop-down list and that sort of thing. So application of NEPA to US citizens and corporations engaging activities in other nations. Yes, your mind is officially blown. Mine is as well, that ultimately these national environmental laws can apply extraterritorially when individuals or corporations are engaged in actions wholly within another nation, but they do. So that's what we're talking about in this category. And there are limits to this. So it can, for example, you cannot apply preferences to other national actors, but can update and enforce domestic laws to help achieve intended goal. And what we mean by this is, the best example is the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Dolphin Safe Tuna campaign. You can look this up as far as a history, but the United States, when it passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act, it was very engaged in wanting to enforce it. And one of the ways that it wanted to enforce it is it wanted to, it certainly enforced it in US waters and also with US actors, fishers, say tuna fishers, that were then in other jurisdictions outside US jurisdiction, other waters. It still wanted to enforce the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It used to be, and it still happens to some degree, but it used to be that, the way in which you capture tuna, it just so happened that tuna would congregate in waters, particularly in the Pacific, where dolphin, so if you found pods of dolphin at the surface, below them often, with other circumstances, there would be a school of tuna. And then so what you would do is you would bring your boat and you would wrap, you would trawl around, make a circle around the dolphins and effectively drop a net and then encircle that net by making a circle around, just driving the boat around and bringing the net together and then, having it seal at the bottom and then pulling it up, and same net process. And then that process would create like a big gulp, big net that then would pull up from the bottom, and a lot of dolphins will get trapped in the net. Since then, we have both technologies. We have holes at the top that allow the dolphins to escape, where you can still get the tuna that are deeper. And we have other processes and methods. But at that time, much of the tuna that was caught would have, would be dolphin unsafe. And so the United States certainly put limits on not using this technology domestically and ensuring that the tuna that was caught domestically was safe for dolphins, that wasn't harming dolphins in the process or killing them. But one of our nearby neighbors, Mexico, they didn't necessarily implement this new technology. These nets are expensive and the technology has to be, retroactively implemented. It wasn't cheap to do it, but a lot of Mexican tuna fishers were still fishing in a way that weren't allowing dolphins to be fully protected in the process. And so the United States wanted to apply the Marine Mammal Protection Act to the Mexican fishers in Mexican waters by prohibiting the importation of tuna. And the United States at the time, it's the World Trade Organization, but the precursor to the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades, another international or global multilateral law, and that's the again the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. It was we were a signatory. The United States was a signatory at the time. It's now the World Trade Organization. GATT was its predecessor, and so was Mexico. And effectively, what we were doing is banning the import in order to protect. In order to enforce the Marine Mammal Protection Act, because we didn't have direct jurisdiction over Mexican nationals in Mexican waters, the United States was banning the importation of Mexican tuna into the United States. And of course, the let's call it the World Trade Organization, but the precursor to the World Trade Organization held that was a violation of their obligation, the United States obligations on the World Trade Organization, because there is no agreement in the World Trade Organization, or GATT at the time, to protect dolphins. That was a national law of the United States that was being applied extraterritorially to non-citizens of the United States and non-entities. So you cannot prohibit. Of course, what the United States did is, so it stopped and it allowed for the importation. But what it did is there was an interesting campaign. It supported a campaign by private campaigners in the United States to label. So they had labeling requirements. This is national. This is a national law about labeling. Like you would see labels for calories and, you know, nutritional contents, et cetera, that we see today. There was a label placed on dolphin unsafe tuna or dolphin safe tuna. And it was to identify and distinguish for consumers the difference between tuna that was caught that was ensuring the safety of dolphins and tuna that was caught that was not ensuring the safety of dolphins. And it allowed consumers their consumer preferences to choose between the two. So it was sort of an interesting, it's an interesting story on if you cannot apply, you know, your domestic laws internationally, how can you still try to achieve the policy objectives of those domestic laws while not violating other international agreements that you're subject to and that you're a party to? And this is one example. So it's an interesting example that you can look up and read a little bit more about, and you should if you don't know about it, because it's a great way of trying to think about policy, how to implement policy above and beyond the normal strictures that we would normally think, which are the sort of regulatory and legal format. How can you work in other combinations of things, including public awareness campaigns, what we would call sort of soft laws or laws that are not formalized, right? Ways in which to sort of, you know, get the public in agreement with your actions and activities, not unlike what I was talking about in terms of, you know, another country's fishers protecting seals because they see the seals as being, you know, partners and beneficial and not as hazards and, you know, and problems for them, that kind of thing. The third category of global environmental law is comparative environmental law. And that's where we seek to find the sources of environmental law from different countries and compare the effects of such laws. I mentioned, I mentioned it in terms of our, you know, our main fishers versus our, you know, other country fishers and relative to seals, for example. But we compare the body of law on a subject of country A to a body of law on same subject of country B. And we compare the purposes, approaches, and outcomes, all the different things. Like, what are you trying to do, or how are you doing it? And then how is it, you know, how is it yielding? I think my example is a pretty good example to get a sense of what that means. And that helps to understand how different frameworks and approaches can achieve policy goals, right? Getting people to buy in. So there's one way, I mean, when you force people through force or fear, when you have high enforcement costs, it's just that. You get people maybe to do what your objective is, but they don't do it willingly. They don't do it voluntarily. You have to have high enforcement, and high enforcement is costly. If you can get people to buy into the idea of what you're trying to do, it's obviously a much better way because it then is self-enforcing. And so you can just look at the differences. You can look at how, you know, how countries go about trying to achieve certain objectives, big policy goals, how they implement those goals, and then what are the outcomes. We can look at those kind of things. So just one example, and this is a sort of scaled example, but sources of environmental law. And we talked about this early on in the introduction overview of environmental law. In the United States, the source of environmental law comes from the Commerce Clause, which is in the US Constitution, but the environment, the Commerce Clause is about commerce, interstate commerce. What that just says is effectively that the federal government can control issues of interstate commerce. So the federal government has jurisdiction over interstate commerce, can create laws relative to interstate commerce. And that's important because that gives the federal government jurisdiction and the capacity to, you know, to control a wide, vast area, depending on how broadly you define commerce between states and what actions affect interstate commerce. There's a not necessarily famous, but a known decision in the environmental field in the United States called SWANK. SWANK is an acronym for a local regulatory body within a state or regional body. In the SWANK decision, what effectively was happening is under the Clean Water Act, there were migratory birds. So there were these birds that migrate, and they migrate from Canada to Mexico through the United States and back and so on and so forth. Certainly between states of the United States, you get it, the birds move interstate. And what they were doing is they were flying into these bodies of water, ponds, let's call them. Ponds are very small lakes wholly within certain states. And they were using, these are waterfowl, so these are birds that are, you know, obligatory to water bodies. They need water bodies. And so they were using these water bodies as stopping points during their migratory process throughout the year. And as a result of that, the federal government claimed jurisdiction over these wholly within state water bodies and said that under the Clean Water Act, federal law, that jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act included these water bodies because the birds are migratory and they're thus connected to these water bodies, and thus there is their interstate commerce. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that that's too tenuous, that these water bodies that aren't connected through strong watershed connections, direct water, that you can see in the hydrologic process, that they move, interstate, that these are large water bodies, that like big Mississippi River type thing in the watersheds that move in between. If you have a broad to bring forward from our earlier discussions or economist versus ecologist argument, from the ecologist perspective, these water bodies certainly are connected. And this was an ecologist argument that, these water bodies are part of a larger ecosystem that certainly extends beyond interstate commerce, and therefore, under the Commerce Clause, federal jurisdiction. Therefore, enforce the Clean Water Act. But the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that's too far. We can't see that because if they had that kind of connection, if we had that broad ecological paintbrush, then effectively the Clean Water Act would have jurisdiction anywhere and everywhere. It would be the basis. It would be a federal law that would be the basis for almost any federal rule and regulation developed under it that could apply to almost anything, even non-water dependent things. Because certainly if we draw the ecosystem large enough, we have the biosphere, we have the Earth system, and if it includes everything in the Earth system, then it is ubiquitous. The Clean Water Act applies to anything and everything everywhere. And that can't be true. So they set a limitation in Swank, for example. One of the reasons they did this is, one of the reasons you have to make this sort of tortuous argument in the United States is because there is no fundamental environmental right or environmental protection within our US Constitution. We can juxtapose that with the European Union, for example. The European Union has a separate, the countries that are part of the European Union, not the countries themselves necessarily, some do, some don't, but the European Union, the umbrella institution that sort of incorporates all of these separate sovereign nations. It has a separate constitutional protection for the environment, and therefore it elevates the environment. So when you think about making rules, now the environment is a consideration at all levels, right? It's something that needs to be considered when you're talking about, it doesn't depend on, it doesn't matter what activity. It is infused into every activity. When we engage in economic activity, we think of environmental consequences. When we engage in social activities, we think of environmental consequences. The environment is part of our thinking in almost everything we do. And that's what happens when you raise the environment to a constitutional right. And so there's one example. We could say, wow, if the United States had, like the European Union or other nations, had a constitutional foundation for protecting the environment, then we could see, we would have a whole new set of policy tools to apply. We'd have all different types of legislation we could do and regulations we could do to achieve environmental goals. It would fundamentally change the way we could approach environmental issues. And a lot of people think Nepa is the closest analog that we have to that, because if we think about, wow, the environment is considered in anything, well, Nepa, right? Major federal action significantly affecting human environment. It has that equivalence. It's a federal law. It's not a constitutional right, but it has that kind of sort of, it's involved in almost any time that you engage in a significant activity that requires some federal connection. In the United States, you have to consider environmental consequences. So a lot of people say, well, Nepa sort of serves that purpose, not ideally, but in some way, but we can see the corollary. So this is what comparative environmental law is really meant to do. And just to bring the sort of Swank and, versus EU home, remember our sort of hierarchy of laws. We're bringing this forward. We have a whole video on hierarchy of laws. It's in the administrative law section, but I've referenced it many times. We discussed this in the overview, sources of law, in the overview for environmental law, but in the hierarchy of laws in the United States, this helps us understand what that means. We have Nepa, which is a federal law, but otherwise we have no constitutional right to the environment, whereas the EU does. Therefore, like the Clean Water Act, when it's passed, there are regulations, like Swank was saying, those regulations that are about these water bodies that are wholly within the state and are clearly, as far as we're concerned, just connected with intra-state waters. That was the argument anyway. And the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court bought it. But the notion was there are limitations. Since we're living in this world, there are limitations as to what this can do to affect other things. In the EU, there's no such limitation, that any law that would be passed because there is a constitutional environmental right, it would have direct relationships. So there would be very much less in terms of limiting those environmental or challenging any environmental law that comes from a constitutional basis, a constitutional source, on grounds that somehow it violates, right? It violates state sovereignty. And that's what was going on in the Swank decision. That's up to the states to regulate those bodies of water, not the federal government. So now that we've overviewed the three major areas of global environmental law and discussed a number of the policy issues that are involved in defining global environment, that sort of thing, now we have some final thoughts on this matter. The first thing we can say is that global environmental frameworks are incredibly important to solving global environmental issues. They may be the only major way to get agreement, universal agreement between nations, because there's just a lot of variance between countries within the globe, where they're at, what they're thinking, how they define the value systems, their norms, beliefs, and values. All of these things matter, and there's a lot of variance between countries. And so, geopolitical concerns, what's going on domestically, domestic concerns, how is the economy doing relative to other economies, so on and so forth. How are the people doing? What are their social institutions? What are their generalized feelings? How do they define environmental issues? Just a whole variety of differences. But so we can say that trying to find common ground and bring parties together, national parties together to get a sense of, well, we can agree on this and we can define it this way. And therefore, it's really important. It's one of the only frameworks that we have to bring nation states together on major issues, particularly environmental issues. The limits of these mechanisms make it difficult to create agreements that are substantial in mandatory commitments and obligations. We have a lot of global environmental agreements that are not mandatory, right? That exist, but they don't have mandatory language. They have permissive language. They say, it would be nice, this is a good goal, if we can do this, we should, that kind of thing. Best efforts, all these different types of words that are not, they just leave a lot of area for non-committal actions without any serious penalty. So that's a serious limit. So this results in more cooperative agreements that set non-mandatory goals. They're more aspirational in nature. So when we look at major global environmental laws that do exist, formalized agreements, right? And we look at the sort of like the bilateral and multilateral agreements, particularly conventions and protocols and the other major written agreements. Most of them are, they're non-mandatory in their goals. They're more aspirational in nature. And that, it's good that we have this because it helps to move people. It helps to create commonality, a sense of commonality and community, but it doesn't necessarily result in significant actions. And when you have things that are, climate change has to be the best example, but when you have global environmental issues that aggregate and they get worse over time, if you don't, they cumulatively get worse over time, and the ability to sort of mitigate the effects of that are limited as time goes on, it's hard. It makes it very difficult when you can't get agreements quickly and then implement those agreements effectively, universally. Individual country differences and priorities, whether that be development or other things, and philosophy, and say disagreeing with the notion of the environment as a constraining factor, will continue to influence global cooperation on environmental issues. So all of those differences beyond the framework issues of getting a sovereign nation to agree to mandatory things, the idea that those nations differ in their philosophical approaches to environmental issues, how they even define that as an issue, really matters. Still, understanding environmental law from the global perspective can be helpful in finding common ground between nations, as well as enhancing domestic environmental policies. One of the best things about comparative environmental law is that you really understand, it can help you understand how another country thinks about these issues. And in addition to the benefits of understanding how another country thinks about an issue and how they approach those issues, you can also find really important sort of corollaries for your own actions domestically. You can say, wow, that's a really good way of getting buy-in. It's a very good way of reducing the cost of compliance for these particular goals. So there's all kinds of value to be gained out of the process of engaging in global environmental law, whether that's just reviewing how other countries do things, but also as a matter of trying to get another country to start advancing a common interest, understanding how they think about things. So there's all kinds of value to be held when we think about global environmental law, even if in practice right now, it's difficult to get to the action phase, the mandatory sort of action phase in many cases. So that's it. That's our exploration of global environmental law. It also includes the overall. So if you've gone through this sequentially, this is our last video lecture for environmental law. I think it's number 13. So you've had a strong overview of effectively most of the major federal environmental issues in the United States from a legal perspective. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.